Welcome to the podcast of Café des Artistes number 5 on Anselm Kiefer.
Good evening, welcome to everybody. I'm delighted you could be here to join us tonight, and I'm very pleased that the fruit market has agreed to host us. I think this is the first one at this venue. Previously it's been in the Talbot Rice Gallery. My name is Christian Weikop. Just a few words about myself, I suppose. I'm a Chancellor's Fellow here in Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, in the History of Art department. And I guess I specialise on 19th and 20th century German art, modern and contemporary German art in particular. And one of my roles is to work with Artist Rooms, this research partnership, and put a focus on a scholarly focus on the German artists in Artist Rooms, particularly the likes of August Sander, Georg Baselitz, Gerhard Richter, and Anselm Kiefer. And Anselm Kiefer is a very, very important artist of the post-1945 generation that we'll be considering today. And I would just say a few things about Artist Rooms. Artist Rooms was acquired for the nation by the National Galleries of Scotland and Tate through the generosity of Anthony Doffey, and there are over 1,500 works by 36 artists and counting. There's also the Artist Rooms Tour, which is a huge touring project, presenting rooms of individual artists in regional art galleries all across the UK. The idea to improve access to contemporary art. And the Artist Rooms Research Partnership has been alive since 2011. And the first director, Andrew Patrizio, who I'm very pleased is here tonight, asked me actually a while ago to work on an in-focus project on Anselm Kiefer. And this is a big 30,000 word project involving my colleague Lara Day and Hannah Abdullah, which will go online in September, around about the time of the Anselm Kiefer exhibition. There is a big retrospective at the Royal Academy that opens in September on Kiefer, which I would strongly recommend, and not least because I've written for the catalogue. I'm very proud about that. And I should say also I was very fortunate last year in October to actually interview the artist, Anselm Kiefer, in his studio complex just outside Paris. And I'll maybe refer to that a little bit today as well. Just recently also I've interviewed Georg Baselitz. All I need to do now is get hold of Gerhard Richter, and I've got the three big ones. That's my ambition anyway. So yes, the Artist Rooms partnership has been going since 2011. It's a collaboration between Edinburgh, Universities of Glasgow, Newcastle, Strathclyde, working with NGS and Tate, and it's currently led by Professor Neil Cox. And the Café des Artistes series is very much Neil's brainchild. Very, very good idea, I think, to open access to the public and obviously to our own students. And the talks will be podcast, I understand, fairly shortly. Okay, this is very much an informal event, so please feel free to go and grab a glass of wine whenever you like. Don't worry about disturbing the flow of things too much. It's not a formal presentation as such, but I will say a few things about this particular work, Heroic Symbols, before we get into the next part of the evening, which is a conversation between myself and Lara. After we've had that conversation, I will pose several questions for you, the audience, to consider, and you have visual material on the tables in front of you, some postcards of various photographs from Heroic Symbols that you can discuss with the aid of questions on the PowerPoint. And then the second half of tonight, we will shift, if you like, to a different issue, still remaining on Anselm Kiefer, but Kiefer and issues of conservation. And I'm very, very pleased that the PhD candidate, Lara Demori, will be with us to talk about issues of conservation and Kiefer. So I will go to the slide projector, and I will try and resist the temptation to interpret the work, but really to kind of give a description of what Heroic Symbols is all about, the sort of, where, who, when kind of questions there. So, so this is Kiefer then, dressed up, it's a rather unusual sort of crocheted sort of dress outfit, cross-dressing, giving the Sieg Heil salute in his studio, his living studio space in 1969 in Karlsruhe, his Wohnatelier, I suppose you would say. And Here are some more images. The one on the right, he's dressed in a kind of paramilitary costume, apparently walking on water. You can see this old tin bath he's standing on here, surrounded by the detritus of his studio space. He's just getting ready to perform the Sieg Heil action. And, this is, he didn't just perform this Sieg Heil in the studio space. He also, in 1968, 1969, toured various cities in Europe and performed this action, often creating great controversy with whoever happened to be in the space. On the right, you have this image of him giving the salute in front of these pollarded trees. This is in Montpellier, in the south of France. And he tended to give the salute in sort of imperial sites, grand imperial sites. Not always, but that's one feature. He took hundreds and hundreds of photographs, in fact. And he had an accomplice who would take the photographs for him. Sometimes they would have to take the photographs very, very quickly because, there would be a sort of public disgruntlement, obviously, at what he was doing. The Sieg Heil being very much a forbidden gesture in Germany, but also caused great problems outside of Germany as well, of course. Here he is in front of the Colosseum, within the Colosseum on the left, and also the Square of St. Peter's on the right. So these Roman sites here. On the left, Kiefer in the Roman Paestum, the ruins of the Paestum, and we know that Kiefer, a bit like his 19th century predecessor Caspar David Friedrich, was very much enamored by ruins, still is. The aesthetics of ruination is a key aspect of his work. And here he is on the right. This is the Vesuvius crater. And again, he's dressed a bit like Jack Nicholson from Easy Rider or something like that. It's got this sort of, this is 1968, 1969. We think, of course, of, this is a period of student revolt. Kiefer was also part of a kind of Fluxus movement, I guess, at that time. Here is his mentor, in fact, Joseph Beuys. In 1970, 71, 72, Kiefer would go and visit Beuys in Düsseldorf and show his work to him for his approval. He was never taught by Beuys as such, but he often saw him as a great mentor figure. And Beuys was the first to actually kind of validate the heroic symbols, images, the photographs, and say this is a really good action. The photographs and the paintings from the photographs, when he first showed them in Karlsruhe, caused great upset. His tutors got very, very worried about this work and said it could not be shown. And the work wasn't in fact shown until 1975, so some 6 years after he first made it. He did try and show the work in various places, but nobody wanted to show the paintings or the photographs. The work could be, I suppose, put in a wider context, a wider cultural context here, of the forbidden gesture. We think of Charlie Chaplin. I did ask Kiefer whether Chaplin was a source of inspiration to him. He said he was a great admirer of Chaplin, but he wasn't aware of the great dictator when he did the work. Other examples, Peter Sellers famously as Dr. Strangelove, the ex-Nazi scientist who's always trying to resist the temptation to give the salute, refers to the president as Mein Führer on several occasions. And then we have, of course, Springtime for Hitler, Mel Brooks, the producers, 1968. Russian Rhapsody, other parodies of the salute. And more recently, the artist Ottmar Hörl created this installation of 1,250 Nazi gnomes for a southern German city there. So the work, the photographs, though, from '69 that are in the Artist Room's collection, they first appeared in books. The books of Kiefer are very much the incubators of the ideas for his paintings and for installation work. So they appeared in Heroic Symbols of 1969 and also another book called For Jean Genet. Just move it forward. Oh, sorry. And the title Heroic Symbols, he actually came to that idea from reading the magazines that his father owned, Die Kunst im Deutschen Reich. There was a particular article in 1943, an article by Robert Scholz on heroic symbols, the heroism of German art. And he used this as a kind of model, or at least the title of this was a model for him. He often Kiefer often appropriated National Socialist magazines, particularly Die Kunst im Deutschen Reich, but other magazines as well, for his work. From the photographs, he produced a number of paintings in 1970. So this is what I mean by the books functioning as a kind of incubator for ideas. These paintings, as I say, were not shown at the time. He did try and exhibit them, but nobody wanted to take them, particularly his gallerist Michael Werner in Cologne. He wasn't interested in showing them. And so they were rediscovered, actually, around about 2007, 2008, and restored. They were found in his Barjac studio complex. Heiner Bastian suggested to Kiefer that they restore the work, and shown in 2008 in Berlin, all 8 paintings for the first time. People don't really know, they may have seen the photographs, but they don't really know the paintings. Here are some other examples. As I say, there were 8 in the series. Heroic Symbols 1 on the left. You see Kiefer kind of resurrected as this sort of transvestite Nordic god on the left. Here, again, in front of the Rhine. These statues, these neoclassical statues, come from the Schlossbrücke in Berlin. On the bottom right there, Kiefer giving the Siegheil in front of the Pope. Pope Pius XII, I think, who was the Pope during the National Socialist period, who was much criticized for complicity with the Nazi regime. Other works stemming from the photographs, you can look also at Everyone Stands Under His Own Dome of Heaven from 1970. And here, Kiefer makes the figure rather cartoonish, almost. This is in watercolor. It's kind of got a whimsical quality to it. So, the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that Heroic Symbols is not one work, but it's a work that appears in various media between 1969 and 70, in photographs, in watercolors, in oil paintings. This was something that he was almost compulsive about producing. Published first in 1979 in Benjamin Buchloh. Benjamin Buchloh had taken over this magazine, Interfunktionen, issue number 12, which resulted actually in the closure of the magazine. Such was the sensation that was caused when the work was first exhibited. Marcel Breuters wrote, who is this fascist who thinks he's an anti-fascist? And various people pulled the adverts from the publication. It resulted in the collapse of the magazine, in fact. I asked Kiefer whether Hartfield was a source for him, John Hartfield. He said, again, he was a great admirer of John Hartfield, but he wasn't aware at the time of those particular photo montages that Hartfield produced in the 30s of Hitler. And he only said he only came to Dada a little bit later on in the mid-70s. And of course, how are we doing for time? Of course, Kiefer is somebody who's also riffing off Caspar David Friedrich as well. This photograph in the middle was the last image in the Occupations series of photographs, 18 photographs that were published in that magazine, Interfunktionen. And it's a response to Caspar David Friedrich's famous Wander Above the Sea of Fog. Again, Der Spiegel has also tapped into this iconography there in the 1990s. I should just talk very briefly about the ongoing significance of the work. This is not Hitler, this is Chairman Mao, but there is a kind of echo, I suppose, of that gesture in later work by Kiefer. In the late 90s, Kiefer went to China. He produced a series of works on Chairman Mao, and a few are owned by Tate. The one on the right is owned by Tate, and the one on the left is from the Metropolitan Museum. You can see, again, sort of reverberations, if you like, of Heroic Symbols in the Chairman Mao series. And I say it's an ongoing interest for him. On the left, you have an installation that was created for the Gagosian Gallery in New York in 2010. And here he's blown up a number of the photographs that he did not develop at the time, only discovered in 2007, 2008. And he effectively pasted them on lead sheets in a steel box, effectively. And there are sort of suggestions, I suppose, of cattle trucks on the way to concentration camps and this horrible strip lighting that gives this sort of horrible glow over the work. And the work can just be glimpsed, the 76 lead sheets can just be glimpsed through various cracks in this box. Tate has one of these works on the right, you can see in the Artist Rooms collection, 2009, but referring back to the work from 69. A kind of new occupations. Sorry, it's a gratuitous photograph of me and Kiefer. I couldn't resist putting in. I mean, he was very charming. I was very lucky. I had about 2 hours with him, we spoke primarily, I have to say, about his paintings and his woodcut collages because I was working for the Royal Academy, and so I was out there for the RA. But I did take the opportunity to talk to him about heroic symbols as well for the Tate project. And I was interested when I was in the studio in, I say, this ongoing significance of the work. So you can see on the right here, kind of imprinted on the concrete there of one of these Jericho towers, one of the 1969 heroic symbols photographs. And this is a link actually to Lara Demori's presentation because she'll be talking about this installation in Milan, 7 Heavenly Palaces, again, which, 7 towers. So there's a connection there too. Right, we should get on to a bit of a discussion, I guess. Now, Lara worked on this In Focus project, wrote an excellent essay on the issue of the inability to mourn in Germany in the 60s. So just thinking about that a little bit, Lara, I was just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about the specific German context for Kiefer's work, maybe put it in a cultural context of these two important works here. This idea of overcoming the past, coming to terms with the past.
I mean, I think I'd sort of like to split it. So the first is obviously the Mitcherlichs, the inability to mourn, which has become sort of the catchphrase for dealing with the German situation, and which I won't talk about that much. And then I think I'd like to return to the Zieberberg, our Hitler film from Germany a bit later. But I think the situation that we need to be aware of in 68 and 69 in Germany is obviously this sort of state of collective guilt, which is a concept that most of you are probably familiar with. But ultimately is what's gripping the German people. So whether it's the actual perpetrators of the atrocities, so the generation of the grandparents, the parents, sort of older siblings, or then the Nachgeborenen Generation, so those that are born after the war, of which Kiefer is obviously one. His birthday is March 8th, 1945, so he gets in sort of just under the wire.
Yeah.
And interestingly, throughout his work, comments on that and is very, very clear that he's only not a perpetrator because of this birth date, and otherwise he wouldn't be sure what he would have done, which I think is one of the things that he's obviously asking us by appropriating this role and taking these photos. But yeah, so there's this issue of collective guilt, which I think really sort of starts with Jung. He publishes his first essay after the Holocaust in 1945, and I just like to cite his description of the nature of collective guilt because I think it's quite helpful. He writes, "It cares nothing for the just and the unjust. It is the dark cloud that rises up from the scene of an unexpiated crime. It is a psychic phenomenon, and it is therefore no condemnation of the German people to say that they are collectively guilty, but simply a statement of fact." Although in the citation and in the essay, Jung acknowledges that there are some sort of irrational roots to the concept, obviously it also indicts the German people as a whole, and it's sort of a fairly damning statement. It's also clear in Jung, and I think in this sort of collective, that the psychic phenomenon of collective guilt depends entirely on nationality, and it's figured as based on sort of locality and the scene of the crime, which obviously then means that the people who are coming from that same country, who are originating in that same soil, are guilty, right? This is sort of the thing. The problem with it, or the thing that is sort of tragically ironic, is that it taps into exactly the blood and soil rhetoric of the Nazis, which is developed, obviously, as you know, in the Kaiserreich and then the Weimar period as well. So that it sort of is the great irony that despite the fact that the National Socialist period is over, we're still trading in the same terms. And that's something that I think that Kiefer in his heroic symbols engages with quite strongly.
How does Kiefer attempt to address, in a sense, his father's generation? I mean, what is it? Because I've showed some examples of cultural examples of parody, but this work cannot be explained with reference to parody alone. There is an edginess about the work certainly, whenever I look at it, I feel rather uncomfortable. What was his intention in actually? Can we guess? Hazard a guess at his intention behind the actual work?
I mean, I tend to shrink from guessing the artist's intention, sort of as a matter of course. But I think it's, I think in a sense, I mean, and people have written that there's a sort of exorcistic quality to it, that there's this sort of taking this terrible gesture, this terrifying gesture, sort of into yourself, performing it with your own body, really, and that's really acknowledging, you know, if I had been older, I could have done this. There's this sort of idea of replacing the individual part and then becoming an actor in it. Perhaps it's a matter of overcoming it, so perhaps it taps into this German idea of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this engaging with the past, grappling with it, and only then being able to move forward. I'm not really sure.
Well, what I'm trying to sort of suggest, is there an ambivalence about the psychological motivations of the performer of the action? Is it all about critique, or does he, in a sense, has a fascination with fascism? Does he enjoy playing the Nazi in a sense, or is this simply something that a body that he occupies momentarily in order to gain some kind of knowledge?
I mean, again, I think it's difficult to say, but I think, especially in '68, I don't think there would have been that much sort of reward in playing the fascist, because I think, you know, it's a situation where you have the student revolts, you have the feeling of the young generation that most people working in the justice system or working in the education system are really just Nazis who have been sort of briefly sidelined, sort of denazified, and who are now back to their old tricks. And that's, you know, that's why you have the Baader-Meinhof group. That's why you have people really, really acting out and shaking West Germany. So I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, there's a morbid fascination, certainly, this idea of imagining yourself in the role of your father. But I don't know that it can be kind of quite that simple, despite the fact that he obviously says, you know, he wants to find out for himself whether art is possible after fascism, and there's this sort of experimental aspect to it.
I mean, I asked him about his preparation for adopting this position, this role. I mean, he said that he listened to recordings of Goebbels, of Hitler, of Himmler, as a way of kind of preparing himself to occupy that position. And he says somewhere, I've got the quotation, I do not identify with Nero or Hitler, but I have to reenact what they did just a little bit in order to understand the madness. That is why I make these attempts to become a fascist, which is an extraordinary statement, really, isn't it? And I mean, various art historians have commented on how, you know, he almost adopted a kind of Stanislavskian method by listening to these recordings to get himself, you know, in the role, as it were. But when we compare perhaps a work by Kiefer here on the left to one of these photographs by Heinrich Hoffmann, I think you mentioned Hoffmann briefly in your essay, Lara. You know, this is a kind of the mythologizing of the Führer in Nuremberg, the Frauenkirche in the background here. It's an extraordinary photograph, but something different's going on in Kiefer, I guess. I mean, what would you? Is there any thoughts on that?
Well, sort of so many thoughts. No, I mean, I think, of course, well, for one, I think it's very important to kind of parse the individual images because there are very different things happening in the various photographs. So I think this, in his studio apartment, or in his working studio, in the crochet dress, hair is sort of awry, he's barefoot, I think. You know, there are things all around him. Clearly, this is not a monumental photograph. So I think actually the juxtaposition of those two is sort of an interesting one, because I think this photograph has so much more in common with the photographs that you showed at Pestum or in front of a national monument or something like that, where it's very clearly sort of monumentalizing. It's shot from below in a much more flattering angle. I mean, this is probably a self-timer, is my guess, on a table. Yes. So there's no one involved to sort of correct that angle and make it actually seem heroic. There's the issue of, you know, potentially cross-dressing happening and appropriating and performing that gesture instead of this sort of quasi-military uniform that he dons otherwise. which upon closer reflection we obviously know is not a military uniform, but suggests it to us initially.
I mean,
so I think
it's interesting that, he's often photographs himself, he's an individual without the ceremonial trappings of power. And I mean, there are the ones in Montpellier, you're quite right. He sort of adopts certain techniques, for instance, from Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will and Olympia, those particular camera angles. So we see Kiefer, standing on the promenade in front of one of these plane trees. He's kind of framed by the tree. It is monumental. It is Riefenstahl-like, and it's quite deliberately so. Other cases, he's dressed, he's cross-dressing, or he's wearing one of these ridiculous sort of paramilitary uniforms, not quite right. So there's a sort of...
It's also the public-private space, I think.
Right.
I mean, we have to kind of keep in mind the collective we, but if we are Kiefer and we're performing the salute in public, we are actually breaking laws. We are actually not allowed to do that, especially not in paramilitary gear. So there is that as well. And this in his home, it's much more, or in his working space, it's much more intimate. It's much more, I think, a personal sort of appropriation or a personal, a personal engagement with the subject matter.
Right. I mean, Kiefer says on that point, am I a fascist? It is a very important question, and one cannot give a swift answer. The authority, the spirit of competition, the feeling of superiority, these are aspects of me just as they are of each and every one of us. One must choose the right path. To say that I am one thing or another is too simple. I wanted to depict the experience before the response. Again, this is something else that moves it away from simply trying to explain the work through pastiche or parody. It becomes somehow more problematic, doesn't it?
Well, I think part of figuring it in these different locations is that there's this sense of compulsion to perform the gesture in a variety of spaces and in a variety of costumes and what have you. So I think that adds additional shock value to the sort of emotional shock of seeing someone do it, the knowledge that it's illegal, and then this idea of it's happening again and again and again in various iterations. And obviously that's something, you mentioned it briefly in Dr. Strangelove. There's this sense, I think in Kiefer's work here, there's this sense that there's no such thing as leaving this behind just in 45 Stunden know that it's gone, that it's expunged. But instead there's the sense, maybe there's a physical memory, maybe there is some sort of thing that's been passed on. So again, sort of tapping into this collective guilt issue that's based on your nationality, where you're from, that you perform it, that it's in you, and that it sort of comes out at whatever points, inappropriate or not.
Several art historians have talked about the process of giving the salute as exorcism. Is that something you agree with? This idea of the gesture as exorcistic?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I guess to me, exorcism implies that we're done with something,
right?
And that it's good, and that we've taken care of it, and that the ghost is gone.
Right.
And I would suggest that that's not possible. So. And
Kiefer's own compulsion to repeat the work, in a sense, the fact that it's reutilized time and time again. Really, the work from 1969 can be seen. Threads of it can be seen in all his work all the way up to the present day. So it really was an important action for him.
Especially because it wasn't published for so long. I think that really fits into it, that it doesn't, it's not immediately out there and then you just sort of do it again and again, but it's actually under wraps for a while and then it informs the rest of it.
And I should just say very briefly, Benjamin Buchloh, famous art critic, initially he was a great supporter of Kiefer. He really thought what Kiefer was doing was absolutely right. If I can find the line, he actually says somewhere, I won't be able to find it now, of course. But he says that you have to Buchloh says that you have to sort of inhabit history to come to terms with it or to address it. And so he was a big supporter of Kiefer's photo conceptualism or photo performance. And then, of course, he became one of Kiefer's great detractors from the late 70s, early 80s. In a famous essay, particularly Figures of Authority, Ciphers of Regression, Buchloh, possibly because he moved into painting more, into sculpture more, moved away from photography, but maybe because this work actually led to the downfall of that magazine. I'll be interested to know, what degree that kind of played into it as well. But Buchloh moves from a great supporter of Kiefer to one of his detractors, which is kind of interesting, and then supports Gerhard Richter as an alternative. Any more thoughts, Lara, about this before we sort of pass over to the audience about the work?
Well, I think one of the things that we can ask ourselves, and one of the things that comes up a lot in the Kiefer reception, is whether he must be a Nazi since he's a German performing this gesture, or whether being a German and then performing the gesture makes him a Nazi. Sort of how those things are interwoven, and I think that comes up in a lot of the early criticism. Werner Spiess's article, too much of the Germanic. That's sort of the response, which I think is a really interesting one. And I think, again, my argument would be that it's so closely tied to this blood and soil rhetoric that it really actually shouldn't be able to be kind of a question at all. But I think it's an important one. Yeah.
Okay, I've got some questions, and I think on the PowerPoint for the audience to consider over a glass of wine. Just the kind of thing you want to talk about over a glass of wine. I have to say, Andrew Patrizio, when I did a brief presentation for the In Focus a while ago, he had made up quite a few of these. He said, Christian, you can have one for your office wall. And momentarily, I sort of considered the idea. I thought, yeah, I could stick that up. And I thought, what the hell are you doing? This is the absolute last thing you want to do in terms of giving the right impression to incoming students. So anyway, but I thought I'm having trouble psychoanalyzing my own response to the work, really. I'm getting into trouble. So just some questions maybe for you to consider. You have some postcards on the tables showing some examples of heroic symbols. And perhaps, just consider the way in which Kiefer is dressed in those photographs and the particular environments, both indoor and outdoor settings, where he performs the Sieg Heil salute. How does the setting, how does the way in which he's dressed impact, perhaps, on the way in which we read or interpret the gesture? Another question you might want to consider, has Kiefer's fascination with fascism become something of a sensational theatrical device in his work? Some people have said he's kind of, he keeps reiterating this, what are we to make of this? Is the work still provocative? As I say, in 1975, it effectively closed down a magazine. Does it still have that kind of impact when we look at the work? And perhaps more broadly, is it acceptable to artistically represent such a gesture? We didn't mention Jonathan Miese, but he got into trouble. Lara, just very briefly, do you want to mention that case?
Yeah, he's a contemporary German performance artist, and he performed the Sieg Heil gesture at a lecture put on by the Spiegel magazine, June 2012, I think, at an event that was running alongside the Documenta in Kassel. And then he performed it again last summer in, I'm not going to think of the city now, but it was the Schiller Tanz. It was a sort of an experimental performance theater piece where he performed it again, and so then of course he was taken to court for performing this because it is still illegal, and he got off because they said no artistic freedom, and now his next big project is curating the something in Bayreuth in 2016. He's putting on Parsifal, I think. So he's doing well. But it's a really interesting question because it sort of went up and down in the German media, and people were very, very intensely interested in what would happen.
I mean, is it right that there should be special artistic dispensation to make the Sieg Heil gesture? Is that, given that it's a banned gesture in Germany, Miese has been referred to as a sort of inheritor of Kiefer, or at least the neo-expressionist tradition. There. So just some questions perhaps to consider over a glass of wine. Maybe take 10 minutes or so, and then maybe we can capture some of that conversation before we move on to Lara Demori for a very interesting talk on conservation at Kiefer. Okay, thank you. I totally failed to properly introduce Lara earlier on. I completely forgot, I'm afraid. I just wanted to say very briefly that Lara's just completed her doctoral dissertation and has worked on these issues with me, also in relation to the Kiefer project, and has written on artists like Barlach, Algersander, Richard Long, and of course most recently Kiefer, and is currently finishing an edited volume, which is very impressive, The Persistence of Race in German History, Re-examining Constructions and Perceptions of Cultural Narratives of Race in the Wilhelmine Empire, the Weimar Republic, and Under National Socialism. That is a long title, Lara. But it'll be a very impressive volume. Okay, so next then, if we can take some thoughts, some comments, maybe some questions from the floor. Denisa, do we have any volunteers, please? Any offers on the work to get us rolling? Don't be shy. Otherwise, I'm going to pick on somebody.
Yeah, I'm always happy to give Jamie some sound to work with. Is that working okay? The mic? Ah, now it is. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, just some general thoughts. I started talking to this table over here a little bit. Just wondering not to simplify that gesture, and I'm not really answering the questions, but again, just to kick things off, just thinking about his gesture as an act of reclaiming something that is forbidden, contesting it through reclaiming it, and decontextualizing it and destabilizing it. Yeah, that's a sort of simplification of it all, but those were my first thoughts, not knowing anything about Kiefer.
No, yeah, I was interested. You're absolutely right. That's a word I failed to use earlier on. Decontextualizing the gesture. I think that's a useful term, given what he wears and the settings. Reclaiming the gesture. I'm not sure. Has anyone got any thoughts about that? This idea of reclaiming.
Reclaiming the gesture divorced from the meaning it signifies originally.
Right. Does anybody want to come in on that? I don't really want to talk too much, to be honest. Yes?
I think that wouldn't be possible so shortly after that happened. Maybe because this gesture has a long history, and maybe it will be reclaimed in the future, but maybe Anselm Kiefer wanted to point out to that, but definitely for the next 100 years, I think it's taken, this gesture.
I mean, it's certainly interesting that the gesture occurs in front also of Roman sites, right? Because of, long discussion about how the National Socialists appropriated it from Mussolini, and it's an imperial gesture going back to a time before Mussolini too. So there's that, making that gesture in front of the Colosseum and other sites in Rome and in Italy is also very significant. It gives another kind of dimension, doesn't it, to the work? Any other thoughts from the tables about what he was doing, both in his atelier and outside in various locations?
I just wanted to ask about the rediscovery of some of the works in the 2007-8. You said this is sort of slightly off point, I suppose. Was that a deliberate rediscovery? Was it more of this is culturally acceptable now to sort of show these things again? I'm just wondering, because the kind of mid-2000s in Germany seems to be a sort of a re-emergence of it's acceptable to show various signs of kind of national identity, patriotism, whatever. I mean, on an anecdotal level, I was in Germany during the World Cup in 2006 when it was held there, and I was went to watch games with German friends, and everyone was waving German flags, and they said, "This is so strange. This is the first time in my lifetime that I've ever seen a load of people waving German flags." So I wonder if there's a sort of a significance in terms of the kind of reclaiming or whatever the gesture. I wonder if that period around there is an interesting kind of secondary moment in the sort of the lifespan of these works.
Okay, there's a number of very good points there, Harry. Just go back to the first question there. The work was rediscovered, yes, because Kiefer's gallerist, Heiner Bastian in Berlin, came across a catalogue from 1973 in which one of the paintings was reproduced. One of those Ziegheil paintings was reproduced. And he questioned Kiefer about it and said, "What happened to this work? Was this work ever shown?" So this catalogue was for a series of exhibitions called 14 mal 14, a series curated by Klaus Gulwitz, who then famously put Georg Baselitz and Kiefer together in the Venice Biennale in 1980. And actually, in 1973, it was Baselitz who was the first to buy Kiefer's work from that 1973 show. And so he questioned Kiefer about the catalogue, and Kiefer said, no, the work was never actually shown, even though it was reproduced in the catalogue. We didn't show it. And so Bastien said, well, where is it? And Kiefer said, oh, somewhere in Barjac. And the Barjac complex is absolutely massive. And so there was a kind of long investigation. They found the work in a container, and Bastien said, we should restore this work. And Kiefer had reservations about doing this. And he said, well, on the condition that the work is not sold to a private seller, once it's restored, that a museum buys it and buys all the work, the whole body, because I don't want it to be some kind of, I don't know, what did he say, sort of fascist kitsch kind of aspect. I don't want that. He says that it needs to be purchased by a public museum, preferably, in its entirety, if we're going to restore the work. Because he had problems with the idea of it being released as well. So it came from from Heine Bastien seeing the reproduction of one of the paintings in a catalogue for an exhibition where it was never actually shown. And then 38 years later, it was shown in Berlin for the first time in Heine Bastien's gallery. So, there was a lot in the German press about it, in fact, but not the kind of reaction that took place in '75.
Thank you. There are people here who know a lot more about Germany than I do, but I'm very impressed. A year ago, went to the opera at Hamburg, and they were singing the Meistersingers, and they actually stopped the opera towards the end, have a debate as to whether they should be singing that in view of the context. So that struck me how sensitive people in Germany still are,
right,
and how much more sensitive they would have been then. Now, perhaps I'm being a bit devil's advocate, but if I was a young artist wanting to have my name in all the newspapers and everything, I might choose to do something like this. Mm-hmm. Rather than a great artistic gesture, is there not a chance that it might just be a great publicity stunt?
Do you mean in '69 when he first
Yes.
did this? Sure.
I bet you got his name in the papers, and to get your work banned is the first step for.
Well, he didn't actually, and in fact, he showed the work first as part of his examination as a student, and his tutors were very much against it. Beuys, I say, was a supporter of the work. A few of the tutors in Karlsruhe said, "No, we can see what he's doing. He's kind of deconstructing, if you like. This is not a neo-fascist we're dealing with here." So it caused problems in the academy. His first show was, in fact, early in 1970, but those works did not appear in the first show. There were other books of his also dealing with National Socialist material, but not the more provocative Zikal Salute. The first time it was ever seen was in '75 in that magazine, and when it was shown, yes, it certainly caused a sensation, and it caused, as I say, the closure of that publication. So yeah, there was a sensation strategy behind it for sure.
Well, and that I think is what's happening with such contemporary artists as this Jonathan Mies. That's what I mean. I don't know. You can all argue with me later, but I think that's at least part of that approach.
Right. Who's the current Mies? Jonathan Mies is the current bad boy, I suppose, of the Berlin art scene. Yeah. I say he's been discussed as inheriting the Baselitz Kiefer tradition in that sense.
This again isn't really quite following on from what we've just said, but I was just thinking about the gesture as Kiefer's talking about it, and a comparison with the gesture as it's used in films like The Producers, even The Sound of Music, and how important it is to look at Kiefer's work and to think about the gesture as something terrible and to keep it in that context. And really only an artist could do that. That the films, The Producers is really funny, and we saw it in Berlin when it first came out, and we roared with laughter. This was back in '73.
What was the German reaction to it?
They didn't find it quite as funny as we did. I think we were the lone laughers in the cinema, really. But I mean, it is important, I think, that Kiefer has done this and that it's still discussed, because otherwise it can be trivialized, it can become funny, it can become just something neo-Nazi that you're uncomfortable with, but it isn't relating back to the original historical moment.
That's a very good point also in relation to Charlie Chaplin, Deborah, because I asked Kiefer about Chaplin, and he said, well, Chaplin regretted making that film in the end, The Great Dictator. He said because, he portrayed Hitler as a funny man. But he said, no, he clearly wasn't a funny man. And Chaplin had reservations about, of course it's a great film, but had reservations about the way in which he portrayed Hitler as a clown. So yeah, I think it's an interesting point.
There's also the tradition in German film, starting with Siebenbach, Hitler, a story from Germany, where it is taken quite seriously. So it's kind of nice that you have the two. And then in more contemporary Germany, obviously you have the Leitz-Heimat series, which, obviously you have the Haneke, das Weiße Band, and the Kindergeschichte aus Deutschland, so sort of riffing on the Siebenbach title. So there is, I don't know. I think it's nice to have both, I guess, and perhaps it's necessary to have both. That I don't know, but I think it's good that there's this very serious engagement with the gesture still.
Right. How are we doing for time? Maybe a few. We got a Hannah. Right. Good. Thanks for sorting me out on the timekeeping front. Yeah.
In the 80s, the historians suddenly started saying we weren't the only ones. Pol Pot was pretty bad, so was Stalin. To what degree do you think the arts sort of preceded this standardization, if you like, of the Nazi atrocities, or the equalization in the Historiker Streit in 86, 87, 88, the Bonn School of History and things? All of a sudden they weren't the worst they were arguing. They were just one of all sorts of bad guys. And one sort of thinks this may have been in terms of the exorcism, it could have had an impact. I don't know.
I'm not sure I know either the answer to that question. Ian, no. It's one that I'll mull over this evening. Okay, we should probably move on to Lara Demori. And I'll just say a few words about Lara before she comes up. So Lara then is a second-year PhD candidate in the history of art, and her research project focuses on neo-avant-gardes in Italy and Brazil, particularly on the work of Piero Manzoni. And Lara, help me out, please.
Hello, Jessica.
Thank you. Okay, but she's shifting today to Kiefer because she has had some experience of a particular Kiefer installation in Milan, the Seven Heavenly Palaces. So, Lara.
Thanks, Christian. And I want to now change a little bit the topic of the discussion. I will be focused on Kiefer as well, but I want to consider the problem of conservation in some Kiefer artworks, and particularly in this big, gigantic installation that is in Milan, that is called the Seven Heavenly Palaces. I want to start off by quoting Kiefer directly. I think this quotation helps us to really understand his obsession with materials. Lead, he said, lead symbolized melancholia, the black bile. Once in an old house, I saw an exhaust pipe made of lead, and I was literally fascinated by that matter. Later on, I came to know that it also had all those symbolic values. I feel close to lead because it's like us, it's in flux. It's changeable and has the potential to achieve the higher state of gold. This is something that Kiefer said in an interview in 2005, talking about his first experience with the melting of materials, particularly with the melting of lead, because he discovered that melting lead released a lot of color, particularly gold, and he was so fascinated that he starts incorporating lead in his artworks. For example, in this artwork that belongs to the Artist Room collection, that is called Septo Sculpture Taking Tom des Etoiles. This artwork actually comprises the two pieces that you can see, so the canvas and also the structure, the bookshelf. Particularly in the canvas, there are a lot of materials applied to the canvas, so shellac, heart, sand, wood, paper, glass, and lead. So it's a very fragile and heavy canvas. At the same time, he doesn't use not only metals, but also natural elements. For example, this is a quite emblematic artwork because there is this palm cast in resin, and there are surrounding 30 paintings. There are including palm fronds, sand, seeds, shellac, adhesive. So he's using a lot. He's very fascinated by the different qualities of the matters. And at the same time, of course, Kiefer artworks are very fragile. And he's very conscious about the precariousness of his works. So he has created in his studio in Barjac a big archive collecting all the materials that he have used during these years. And he's very helpful with the restaurants. Every time that restaurants need to intervene on his works, they can ask Kiefer directly for the supply of the materials. At the same time, he's also quite fascinated by the fact that his artwork might decay. So sometimes he doesn't mind when his artworks start to crack, because he is very fascinated by the process of aging of the artworks. Now I want to focus a little bit with this installation. This installation has a troubled history and is a permanent installation that Kiefer created in 2004, specifically for this new Museum of Contemporary Art that is called Hangar Bicocca. And it has a very complex meaning that I won't address specifically. I will just give an idea of the meaning of the artwork, and then I will focus more on the construction and on the problems of conservation. So with this artwork, there are 7 towers. Kiefer wants to represent overall the human research in continuous research for a balance between heaven and earth. At the same time, is a kind of a homage to the city of Milan, to the landscape of Milan that is quite mixed between Romanesque churches and also modern skyscrapers. And these 7 towers or palaces or sanctuaries are the one described in a Jewish treatise, a very ancient one, and are the palaces that the worshipper need to ascend in order to arrive at the revelation of God. So it has various meanings, like the precariousness, as you can see, the precariousness of the human condition, but at the same time a direct description of this Jewish treatise. So these towers are constructed by the overlapping of this concrete block. These blocks are very heavy, and overall we have this general sense of precariousness, of instability, but actually by the overlapping on several materials, because each septa is like separated, the slabs are separated also by the overlapping of books, lead books. Actually, they are in a perfect static equilibrium. So this installation was created in 2004, and it was left untouched until this is the planimetry of the whole installation. So this space is really gigantic, and the installation occupies all the space. Then we can see the prototypes, the 3-dimensional prototypes that Kiefer made before actually constructed the installation in Milan. These are in his studio in Barjac, and they are not really fixed. So sometimes he has all these towers, and sometimes this tower actually fall down. It's a kind of natural process for him. He's quite pleased when he sees the towers falling down. That's what he said. And also, he made some sketches before, but this painted photograph, both are belonging to the artist room collection. He actually made this painted photograph later, after the installation in Milan, but we can really see here that the theme of the tower is a recurrent theme and an important theme for Kiefer. So, getting back to the installation, it was left untouched in this condition until 2008. In 2008, the museum, the Hangar Bicocca, was closed due to works of remediation of the ground, because it has a very fragile ground. So this artwork was dismantled, not the actual structure of the towers, because they are quite heavy and it's not easy to carry out these towers, but all the pieces that are, all the decorative elements that you can see here, like the paintings, the pictures, and here is a better photograph. You can see the oak leaves. So all these decorative elements were dismantled, and they construct a new ground of beaten earth. And in this occasion, they realized that actually also the concrete blocks were started to crack. So they refined the concrete blocks, and in order to guarantee the safety of the visitor, they actually construct inside of each tower iron props fixed to the ground that are running from the ground to the top of each tower. So in order to preserve the safety of the installation. Before the reopening of the hangar, of course, they need to reset up. These are other particulars. The picture that we have seen at the ground of the tower before are actually placed also to the top, because each tower is made unique by all these elements. So they need to restage all these elements that they are decorating the towers. So before, these are another the particular of the lead books that are placed between the slabs. So they decide to create an archive cataloging of the materials that are decorating these towers, and also they create a perfect planimetry with all the spatial relationship between these elements in order somehow to preserve the future of this installation. Unfortunately, the hangar Bicocca was closed again in 2010 because more works of the remediation of the ground were needed. So they closed the installation again. They dismantle all the decorative elements again, and they build another floor, and they proceed, of course, with the restaging of all these elements. This second intervention in 2010, I have to say, was less intrusive than the previous one, because the concrete blocks were already refined, so there was no need to work on them anymore. And so the operation was quite smooth in the second intervention. And all the intervention, both in 2008 and in 2010, were carried out by the Antonio Rava studio, that he's a Turin-based restorer. Here you can see a picture that I have taken during the second restoration in 2010 with all the restaurants working on the ground, because one of the difficult things of this installation is this gigantic ground made of sand and debris and ashes all mixed all in one, like almost in a random situation, and so in 2010 they replaced all the elements in the original location. What happened? The problems of the future of this installation, that apparently in 2010 was fixed the situation, are of course the fact that there are organic materials in this installation. Like, for example, I've shown the oak leaves, or the fact that the ground is made of ash. So there is the need sometimes to replace of this organic material. Another problem is the fact that the soil of this place is quite fragile, because in 10 years they did works of remediation, of recovery of the ground twice. So it means quite fragile. And a third problem is the fact that the Hangar Bicocca, this museum in Milan, hosts also other temporary exhibitions. So every time Kiefer installation needs to deal with surrounding other temporary exhibitions. And as a matter of fact, I went to visit the installation a month ago, and I've just found out that they have built a new cover, a new pavement, which is quite, it's ephemeral, it's not made of concrete, it's probably made of resin, but it gives an overall a completely different perception of the artwork. And here you can see how was the situation before. So before, the audience was forced somehow to walk around the overall installation and to see the work from afar. So there was a distance between the visitor and the installation. With this new ground, the good thing is actually that visitors can engage more directly with the towers. They can come closer. And one of the meaning of this artwork is that it means to be an upward path for the worshipper. So also the visitor is meant to almost like ascend these towers. And with this new cover, somehow this meaning, it's better convey the meaning of walking around the towers and to cross almost the towers. But at the same time, we have this feeling of a sacred space, like a Greek temenos, something that the artwork was made somehow like a religious thing. So overall, the perception, we have good things about the new cover and bad things. So what I want to discuss is about like walking, you have like the postcards on your table, and I want you to focus a little bit on the two images and think really about which maybe is the best cover to convey the meaning of this work, and also which is the best pavement also to guarantee the fruition of this work. And at the same time, an overall more general question is, what are the boundaries of the work of art? The work of art needs to be something that is separated from the audience, like a sacred space, a sacred thing, or it's supposed to be more accessible. So that's it.
Okay, so I'm sure there's some thoughts, comments, questions perhaps for Lara on her brilliant presentation. Very, very good. And after questions, comments for Lara, perhaps if you have more general observations or go back to the first half, we can do that as well, depending on the time. And I've got a few things to say to wrap up as well, but not yet. Anyway, Lara, I'm just very interested in this issue because there is a paradox. Very briefly, there is a paradox here with this issue of conservation, preservation of Kiefer's work, because as you alluded to earlier on, Kiefer is very much interested in ruination, the processes of ruination. I suppose he had a Fluxus background. He has certain points of contact with arty popular artists in that sense. This idea of organic matter deteriorating. He likes that, so he's always rather amused when confronted with this issue of preservation and conservation. He does, of course, collaborate with the museums and the galleries in this respect. But he finds it quite funny. I asked him about this myself. He finds it quite funny because for him, if it just kind of rotted, if the towers collapsed, that would be okay. But of course, conservators are very busy trying to keep these things maintained. It's an interesting paradox in relation to Kiefer. I don't know if you want to respond to that or...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are completely two different points of view, the artist's point of view and the conservator. And if we think about from the logic of the conservator, we need to preserve these artworks, even sometimes going against the desire of the artist. That's my personal point of view. And especially in this artwork is quite emblematic because what I've been called like they're ruins almost. They represent ruins after the Second World War, but also ruins in general because Kiefer is very fascinated by, in a neo-expressionist way, neo-romantic way from ruins. So there is, yeah, I think a sort of paradox. There are ruins, but we are trying to preserve them somehow.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think certainly he would say that he's very keen on the idea of more participation. He would like people to get closer to the work. Mm-hmm. He'd certainly be for that idea. I'm not sure whether he'd be for this particular floor. But anyway, maybe we can ask the audience about what they think. Which floor is best on this work? Any thoughts? Any comments on these issues?
One thing I was kind of interested in was kind of the changed sensorial experience between the two works, because in a kind of pseudo-sacred space, things like sound, temperature, ambience all becomes kind of important to the experience. So when you have this kind of resin, wooden, whatever floor added in, I imagine that kind of people's, the way that they experience it will be completely different, in addition to the visual and the magnification that comes when you approach a tower up close. So I guess, Lara, to repeat what you were just saying to us, but what was your distinct differences between the first 3 times when you went there and this 4th time? What was it different sensorially?
Well, I personally, I don't know if I can say my opinion. I personally prefer how was it before, because yes, you were seeing the work from afar, but it has a different experience. I mean, you were really feeling to be in a sacred space, like it was a modern cathedral. While now there is also a sort of disconjunction between the each towers. They almost seem like to be separate artworks and not an installation like one installation anymore. So I'm pretty against by this sort of new covering, which is ephemeral, so it's they are supposed to get rid of it at a certain point. And Kiefer is not aware about it, so he thinks his artwork is like it was before. So this is my personal experience. I really enjoy, even if I was seeing like the work from afar, I really enjoy to walk around and see this area as a sacred area. While now, yeah, you can come closer, but a lot of details are not visible anymore, like the oak leaves on the sun are not visible anymore because they are just covered. So it's like the perception is totally different. It's more easy to walk around the tower, of course, but the perception, I think it's different and it's a worse perception of it.
Lara, can I just ask, who stipulated then that a barrier should be erected here in front of the work? Whose idea was that, do you know, in the first instance?
I don't know, because I've seen picture of Kiefer in 2004, soon after it was built, that he was driving the bicycle around the towers. Yeah. So basically, there was no a fence already. No. They built it up just when they opened the hangar to visitors. I think that was a matter, of course, of fruition. So I think like the director decided like the actual space. Because
at the Royal Academy in September, the director, Kathleen Soriano, spoke to Kiefer, and Kiefer was very, very keen that there's still a discussion actually about whether they're going to install a tower in the main square. Kiefer was very, very keen that people could actually go into the towers.
I mean, that was a kind of original idea, I think. I think he would have been really pleased of people like crossing actually into the towers, but I mean, as a matter of safety, that was quite impossible.
Sure.
Even because, yes, they are tall and there is space because they are empty and they're inside, but still are not fruitable in that sense. You can walk around, that's good, but not actually cross inside the tower.
Thanks. I mean, maybe I could offer a wee speculation. It's quite common then for when these big spaces are opened in Europe is you get a signature artist to do a signature piece, and it costs, you know, it's a very expensive thing to do. So the idea that you would then not be able to approach it and see it almost as an image, we have a Kiefer here, and it is enormous. It must, let's say, be very expensive. So the idea of now you can walk in between the towers seems like it's been slightly desacrified in a way. Slightly, the atmosphere of the image is lost to some extent. And this is a complete speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't consult Kiefer over the floor this time. They won't consult him when they take down one of the towers and put a Mario Merz igloo?
No, no way. They're not going to do it. I mean, the space, this tower actually fulfill all the space. So the space is created for the towers and the towers are created for the space. There is a constant dialogue, and that's why it's so beautiful being there actually. And I'm sure that they didn't consult Kiefer and they won't consult Kiefer if they're working on the ground. But I mean, it's a symbol for the hangar Bicocca now, the Kiefer installation. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay, fair enough. I'll accept.
Hi, I was just wondering, maybe, I don't know how much you know about this, but what would you call it? Some sort of steel truss put through the towers that you mentioned. I mean, it sounded like that wasn't there to start off with.
It wasn't there in 2004. So actually, you're right. The first years, this tower were in a static equilibrium, but we weren't really sure about the actual balance. Then they think that it was better to build these iron props. Now we are sure that they're not going to falling down, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, for me, just even looking at it on these little postcards, I felt really, oppressed, or I felt really worried about them coming down.
Yeah, and that's,
seems to me like
the meaning
a good
he wants to convey. I mean, he wants to convey this sense of instability, precariousness, and danger somehow. But now we are sure that they're not going to fall down. But I mean, you're right. That's the purpose.
Yeah, but I mean, I find it really interesting that for Kiefer that was presumably important that he didn't necessarily want the trusses to be put up, I don't know, but the fact that he would let, people walk around with it without any of this safety equipment, who knows what could have happened, were they not put in?
No, but
I find that interesting.
Like this. I mean, he designed the tower to be in a perfect static equilibrium. So apparently they were not supposed to fall down. But now, I mean, with the iron props inside of the towers, there's more guarantee of safety, let's say.
I'd feel safe to visit now.
Yeah, you can go and visit them.
Sorry, I have a question. Did he envision visitors actually climbing the space? Because no. Okay, because I was thinking it is not possible because there's no staircase or anything, but maybe they could have a balcony to create, at least see it at another level, because the whole concept of the text, you said a Jewish text, is ascending to heaven. So maybe you could interact in that sense if they had different levels, where you could appreciate the space from a different point of view or angle in a way.
You're right. I mean, the meaning is this, but I'm sure that even in the original design, he didn't design the towers to be climbed. I mean, to be crossed somehow, to walk closer to the towers for sure, but not to be climbed.
And what about the surface as well? Instead of doing it of that material, they could have done it of something transparent, I think. At least you could see, like, the oak leaves, what remains in the sand and everything, I think. I don't know.
That would have been a better solution, but I'm quite sure, I mean, not really, because you never know how things are going in Italy, but I'm quite sure that this pavement is ephemeral. So as right now there is a Sildomerialis exhibition like just next to the towers, they needed to transport a lot of materials to get to the other space of the hangars, and they need to cross with the cars and stuff. So now it's far more functional, And they say, I mean, I've been speaking with people working there, not the directors, and all the people working there say it's going to be ephemeral, so they're going to be rid of it, but they are not sure.
Okay.
That's the problem. And I hope it won't stay like this. I mean,
for certain. Yeah, thank you.
On the thing with the stage there, one is actually an actor on the stage, whereas in the upper one, you're an observer sort of from the outside. And I could imagine, I haven't ever seen this thing, but I could imagine that being the actor on the stage is actually rather exciting. Going up onto this platform and walking around and being part of the Inszenierung, if you like, of the whole thing is actually rather good, rather than being at the edge and saying, oh, it's over there, have a look.
Well, I did the experience. I mean, I was walking on this ground, and I can assure you that it's completely different. I mean, you don't feel the sense of magnificence anymore. So there's no actually...
Oneself, though, one's own power on the stage. Is one not enhanced by being there?
Can be something like this, but I didn't got this sense, actually.
Empathy.
I was feeling to be no more in an artwork. I was feeling just to be surrounded by random constructions. I didn't feel the sense of unity anymore. This is important for the meaning of the artwork.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I should just very briefly, Neil's looking at me. You mentioned Lara, you mentioned that Kiefer was cycling around the space, which is kind of interesting, because when I went to the studio, all his assistants have bikes. The studio, which is the former depot of a Parisian department store, is so vast you can't see the end of it. And his assistants are going around on bikes all day to get from one end to the next. So he does work on an absolutely massive scale. It's quite extraordinary. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Café des Artistes. For information on upcoming events, please visit the Artist Room's Research Partnership website or like our Facebook page.